October 14th, 1949, 3:18 p.m. The corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue. Albert Anastasia stepped out of a black Packard and onto Harlem pavement without hesitation. Mid-afternoon, broad daylight. No disguise, no urgency. The traffic didn't stop for him, but the people did. Conversations thinned. Footsteps slowed, heads turned, then turned away. This was not his city. Everyone there understood that before he did. Anastasia didn't come armed like a soldier. He came dressed like a decision already made. Dark suit, narrow tie. His hands empty but not relaxed. He crossed the street against the light, ignoring the horns, ignoring the looks, walking as if Harlem were just another extension of Manhattan he hadn't claimed yet. Inside a bar 3 doors down, Bumpy Johnson was already watching. He didn't stand. He didn't signal anyone. He didn't move at all, because by the time Albert Anastasia chose to walk north of 110th Street uninvited, the situation was no longer forming. It was already set. The lines had been drawn years earlier. The rules had been tested. What was about to happen wasn't a confrontation. It was a demonstration. And when Anastasia walked back to that Packard 27 minutes later, Harlem would never forget how close New York came to open war, or why it didn't happen. The man who didn't ask permission. Albert Anastasia had built his reputation on entering rooms where he wasn't welcome and leaving behind silence. As the enforcement chief of Murder, Inc., he operated with the backing of the Italian Commission and the fear of every syndicate east of Chicago. When Anastasia walked into a territory, it wasn't to negotiate terms. It was to remind people who had the capacity to erase them. Harlem, in his mind, was overdue for that reminder. He was not coming north for spectacle. He was coming because the syndicate's map still had an uncooperative shape on it, and men like Anastasia hated irregular borders. Harlem kept its own money moving. The numbers ran without Italian permission. The clubs paid the right people, but not the people who believed they had a right to everything. That wasn't an insult to Anastasia. It was a defect in the system. Defects got corrected. By the late 1940s, he had already proven what his presence could do to a city. He didn't manage operations the way others did, with long meetings and paper trails and polite intermediaries. His authority came from outcomes, a name removed from a room, a problem that stopped breathing. The underworld respected many kinds of men, but it feared only a few. Anastasia was one of the few, not because he was loud, because he was willing. He chose to walk into Harlem in daylight for a reason. Night belonged to ambushes and misunderstandings, to men who wanted to claim they didn't see what they did. Daylight was for statements. It meant he wasn't sneaking. It meant he wasn't asking. It meant he assumed the people watching him would do nothing but watch. The Packard rolled up clean and slow as if it had every right to stop where it stopped. The driver stayed inside. Anastasia stepped out alone, not as a courtesy, but as a calculation. Alone suggested confidence. Alone suggested that if something happened, it would be a massacre, not a fight. He adjusted his cuff once, glanced up the avenue, and started walking like he knew where he was going. Harlem noticed him immediately, but it did not react the way other neighborhoods did. There was no rush of attention, no men stepping forward to prove something. People simply turned their bodies slightly, creating space, the way water pulls back from a passing ship. That kind of movement didn't look like fear. It looked like discipline. Anastasia read faces as he walked. He saw the old men by the storefronts who didn't smile. He saw the boys running errands who didn't stare too long. He saw women who kept their eyes forward and kept moving. It told him something important. These weren't people waiting to be taken over. These were people used to living under rules they didn't need to explain to strangers. He reached a small bar off 7th Avenue that had nothing about it that looked like a battleground. No curtains drawn. No doorman with a gun bulging under his coat. Just a narrow entrance, a few windows, and the kind of steady foot traffic that meant the place was protected without having to announce it. Inside, the air was cooler and heavier, thick with smoke and routine. The bartender didn't ask who he was. He didn't have to. A man like Anastasia carried his own introduction. The bartender's hand paused on a glass, then continued. That small decision mattered. It meant the room would not perform for him. It meant nobody was eager to show him respect, and nobody was foolish enough to show him defiance. Anastasia chose a stool where he could see the door and most of the room. He didn't order right away. He watched. He waited for the environment to bend. That was how it usually worked. In most places, the presence of a predator changed the temperature. Voices lowered. Eyes dropped. Men began calculating exits. It did not happen. Instead, he felt something he rarely felt in unfamiliar rooms. He felt that he was the one being evaluated. There were men in that bar who looked ordinary enough to be ignored by an outsider. A man reading a newspaper too calmly. A man near the back who never lifted his drink. A man by the window who kept his hands visible but never relaxed his shoulders. None of them stared, and that was the point. Staring was emotional. These men were working. The pressure arrived without sound. Anastasia didn't see a gun. He didn't see a knife. He saw alignment. The room had shifted into position around him. Quietly, naturally, like it had rehearsed this kind of moment before. That told him Harlem had a center of gravity, and it wasn't him. He asked the bartender, low and flat, where he could find Bumpy Johnson. The bartender didn't answer immediately. He didn't refuse either. He simply looked toward the far end of the bar, where a man sat with his back protected by the wall and his eyes on everything. No jewelry, no performance, just stillness that didn't need to announce itself. Anastasia turned his head and saw him. Bumpy Johnson didn't rise. He didn't wave him over. He didn't acknowledge him like a guest. He looked at Anastasia the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved, waiting only for the problem to admit it is cornered. Anastasia stood, straightened his coat, and walked toward him. And as he crossed the room, he understood the first real truth of Harlem. This was not a place that needed permission from outsiders to exist. This was a place that decided quietly who was allowed to leave. Harlem was not an open market. By 1949, Harlem was not leaderless, not fractured, and not confused about who protected it. The numbers banks, the clubs, the street crews, the political connections, they all ran through Bumpy Johnson. He didn't announce his authority. He enforced it quietly. Outsiders didn't survive long enough to misunderstand that. Anastasia's mistake wasn't arrogance. It was assumption. From the outside, Harlem looked like opportunity. Cash-heavy, densely populated, politically neglected. Italian bosses had built empires on neighborhoods like this before. They arrived with structure, muscle, and money, convinced that order followed force. But Harlem wasn't waiting for order. It already had one. It just didn't look like theirs. Bumpy Johnson had spent years shaping that reality without ever needing a title. He didn't sit at the head of long tables issuing commands. He didn't send men out to announce new rules. He let patterns do the talking. A club that stayed open after midnight without police interference. A numbers runner who never got robbed twice. A landlord who stopped pushing evictions after a single phone call. These weren't coincidences. They were signals. The men who lived there understood something outsiders rarely did. Power in Harlem didn't flow downward. It circulated. You didn't pay tribute to Bumpy because you were afraid of him. You paid because he solved problems faster than the police, quieter than the courts, and more permanently than anyone else. He made chaos expensive. That was why the Italians had always approached Harlem indirectly, through intermediaries, through partial partnerships, through men willing to take a cut and carry a message. They tested the edges but never crossed the center. Everyone knew where the center was. Everyone knew who sat there. Albert Anastasia believed centers could be moved. From his perspective, Harlem was a logistical error, a neighborhood generating revenue without feeding the larger machine. The commission tolerated inefficiency only when it served a purpose. Harlem no longer did. Bumpy Johnson had proven too independent, too durable, too respected. That kind of autonomy made men like Anastasia nervous. Independent power couldn't be controlled. It had to be neutralized or absorbed. But neutralization required leverage, and Harlem didn't offer much. The numbers banks didn't answer to Italian financiers. The street crews didn't rely on outside weapons. The clubs didn't need Italian protection to survive police scrutiny. Bumpy had spent years building buffers between Harlem and anyone who wanted to own it. He paid cops just enough, politicians just enough, business owners just enough. Nobody felt squeezed. Nobody felt cheated. That was the difference. Anastasia assumed Harlem's resistance was symbolic, that once the right man showed up in person, the resistance would collapse. He'd seen it happen before. A visit from him usually changed minds. People remembered their place. Organizations realigned themselves. Harlem did not realign. The moment Anastasia walked those streets, he stepped into a market that wasn't for sale. No one rushed to impress him. No one rushed to challenge him either. That silence was not weakness, it was cohesion. It meant decisions had already been made long before he arrived. Inside the bar, that reality pressed in slowly, not as hostility, but as certainty. The bartender didn't hurry. The patrons didn't move. No one tried to broker an introduction or offer a drink on the house. Nobody asked what he wanted. That wasn't an oversight. It was policy. Bumpy Johnson had trained Harlem to behave that way. You didn't react to outsiders. You observed them. You let them expose their intentions. You gave them just enough space to make a mistake. That was how Harlem survived waves of attention from men who thought power was portable. When Anastasia finally looked toward Bumpy, he wasn't seeing a rival in the traditional sense. Bumpy wasn't competing for national reach. He wasn't trying to sit on the commission. He wasn't building an empire that extended beyond his streets. That was what made him dangerous. He had no incentive to compromise. Harlem didn't need to expand. It needed to endure. And Bumpy Johnson understood endurance better than anyone in New York. He had watched ambitious men rise fast and die faster. He had watched alliances rot from the inside. He had watched Italians, Irish, Jews, and politicians all overreach eventually. His strategy was simpler. Control what you can protect. Protect what you control. Anastasia was used to markets that bent under pressure. Harlem didn't bend, it closed ranks. By the time the two men sat across from each other, the outcome was already constrained. Violence was possible, but costly. Absorption was unlikely. Humiliation was unacceptable. What remained was recognition. Harlem was not an open market. It was a closed system, defended not by fear alone, but by loyalty that had been earned slowly and enforced without noise. And Albert Anastasia was finally beginning to understand that this was not a place you conquered. It was a place you either respected or paid for misunderstanding. The message that traveled faster than the man. Anastasia's arrival didn't surprise Harlem because he was important. It surprised Harlem because no one had told him not to come. Word reached Bumpy before Anastasia finished crossing 7th Avenue. Not from one source, but from many. Barbacks, numbers runners, men who weren't paid to notice things, but always did. By the time Anastasia entered the bar, Bumpy already knew the angle, the timing, and the intent. Harlem functioned on a different frequency than the rest of the city. Information didn't move through offices or official channels. It moved through habits, through who paused mid-sentence, through who stepped aside without being asked, through the way a man's shoes sounded on pavement that didn't belong to him. Anastasia didn't realize it, but the moment his car stopped, he had already been reported. A shoeshine boy near the corner noticed the license plate didn't belong north of 110th. A woman leaving a beauty shop clocked the suit, the cut too sharp for casual business. A runner carrying slips between policy banks slowed just long enough to register the face. None of them spoke to each other. They didn't need to. Harlem had learned how to speak without words. Those signals converged quickly. A bartender 2 blocks away stepped into a back room and made a quiet call. A numbers lieutenant sent a boy down an alley with instructions that didn't need repeating. Someone leaned into a doorway and nodded once. It wasn't panic, it was procedure. This was what Harlem did when something unfamiliar entered its bloodstream. Bumpy Johnson didn't need a warning delivered with urgency. He trusted the rhythm. When enough small movements aligned, he paid attention. He had built his position by listening to people other men ignored. People who survived by noticing danger early and reacting without drama. Those people trusted Bumpy because he had always trusted them first. By the time Anastasia reached the bar, Bumpy knew the name of the man walking toward him. The reason he was there, and the limits of what he would try. He knew Anastasia hadn't come to kill anyone. Not yet. Public daylight wasn't for executions. It was for pressure, for presence, for the suggestion of future consequences that mattered. If Anastasia had come at night with intermediaries or enforcers, the response would have been different. Quiet men would have moved to different corners. Doors would have locked. Weapons would have appeared without being drawn. But daylight meant something else. It meant this was meant to be seen. And anything meant to be seen could be managed. Bumpy stayed where he was. That choice rippled outward. Men who were already shifting stopped. The room didn't tighten. It settled. If Bumpy wasn't moving, nobody else needed to. That was the signal. Control wasn't about reaction. It was about restraint. Anastasia entered unaware that the meeting had already begun. He thought the first move would be his. He assumed the surprise was his leverage. But surprise only worked when it disrupted planning. In Harlem, surprise triggered memory, and memory triggered preparation. The bartender glanced once toward Bumpy and received nothing in return. That was enough. He poured a drink for another customer and kept his hand steady. The patrons didn't look up all at once. They didn't stare. Staring created witnesses. Harlem preferred plausible deniability. Everyone noticed Anastasia individually, quietly, and filed the information away. Bumpy watched the room, not Anastasia. He watched who leaned back, who stayed still, who didn't need to adjust their position. That told him everything he needed to know. His people were in place, not posted, not armed openly, just present. That presence wasn't accidental. It was cultivated over years of doing things the same way every time. When Anastasia finally realized the room wasn't responding to him, he mistook it for indifference. That was his second assumption. Indifference implied weakness. But this wasn't indifference. This was containment. The message had traveled faster than the man because Harlem didn't wait for confirmation. It didn't need to see what Anastasia would do to decide how to handle him. His presence alone was enough context. By the time Anastasia turned his head and saw Bumpy Johnson at the far end of the bar, the situation had already narrowed, not to violence, not to submission, but to a single conversation that would determine whether this visit ended quietly or echoed across New York. Bumpy met his eyes without expression. That was the moment Anastasia understood something fundamental had gone wrong. He had arrived believing he was the message. Instead, he had walked into one. 2 empires, 1 table. When the 2 men finally sat across from each other, there was no greeting, no handshake, no raised voices. Anastasia spoke first, confident, clipped, offering structure, percentages, protection. Bumpy listened without interruption. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. Anastasia wanted to see whether Harlem's king understood the consequences of refusing him. Bumpy wanted Anastasia to understand something else entirely. Anastasia didn't waste time framing the meeting as mutual interest. He framed it as inevitability. His words came out measured, practiced, the language of a man who had ended more conversations than he'd begun. He spoke about order, about efficiency, about how independent operations created friction that attracted attention. He spoke as if the future were already written, and this was merely a briefing. Bumpy let him talk. He didn't nod. He didn't interrupt. He didn't signal agreement or resistance. He held his glass loosely in one hand and kept his other on the table, visible, empty. That mattered. Nothing about Bumpy's posture suggested tension. He wasn't bracing for a threat. He wasn't preparing to counter. He was allowing Anastasia to reveal the limits of his understanding. Anastasia laid out numbers without naming them explicitly. Percentages floated in the air like facts. Protection was offered without explanation, as if everyone in the room already knew what protection meant. It meant fewer raids. It meant disputes handled elsewhere. It meant insulation from problems that arrived with badges or indictments. What Anastasia did not mention was what it would cost Harlem to accept. He didn't talk about who would stop answering to Bumpy. He didn't talk about which clubs would change hands quietly. He didn't talk about how protection always came with supervision, and supervision always came with replacement. Those details were understood. They didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Bumpy waited until Anastasia finished. The silence afterward stretched longer than Anastasia expected. Not long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough to be deliberate. Bumpy took a slow drink, set the glass down, and looked at Anastasia fully for the first time, not at his suit, not at his hands, at his eyes. When Bumpy spoke, his voice was low and even. He didn't reject the offer outright. He didn't challenge Anastasia's authority. He didn't question the commission or the reach behind it. He did something more dangerous. He reframed the conversation. He asked Anastasia how many men he had lost in the last 5 years trying to enforce order in places that didn't want it. He asked how many operations ran smoothly until they attracted attention, precisely because they had been absorbed into something larger. He asked how many times violence solved a problem only to create 3 more. Anastasia stiffened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't the response he was used to. Most men argued from fear or ambition. Bumpy argued from experience. Bumpy spoke about Harlem as if it were a living thing, not territory, not revenue, a system that functioned because everyone understood where they stood. He explained that Harlem didn't reject outside power out of pride. It rejected it because outside power disrupted balance. It introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty brought noise. Noise brought police. That was the point Anastasia hadn't accounted for. Bumpy made it clear that no Italian protection had ever been needed north of 110th Street. Problems were handled internally, quietly, efficiently, without drawing lines that couldn't be erased. Harlem stayed profitable because it stayed predictable. Anastasia leaned back, listening now instead of speaking. The roles at the table had shifted without ceremony. Anastasia was no longer presenting terms. He was absorbing context. He began to understand that taking Harlem would not look like a victory. It would look like constant resistance, constant cleanup, constant explanation to men who expected compliance. Bumpy didn't threaten him. He didn't say men would die. He didn't imply retaliation. He simply stated that Harlem would not change its structure to accommodate outside oversight, that any attempt to force that change would cost more than it returned. Then he stopped talking. That silence was heavier than the first. Anastasia looked around the room again, this time seeing it differently. He noticed the way the bartender never looked directly at him, the way the men nearby didn't lean in to listen, the way no one seemed nervous. This wasn't defiance, it was certainty. 2 empires sat at one table, but only one of them was operating on its home ground. Anastasia understood then that he wasn't facing a subordinate power structure. He was facing a contained one, self-sustaining, loyal to its own logic. Killing Bumpy wouldn't dismantle it. Absorbing it would corrode it. And leaving it alone suddenly felt like the most rational option. He stood first. There was no agreement reached, no handshake to seal terms. But something had been decided. Anastasia had come to test Harlem's king. Instead, he had learned the limits of his own reach. Power without witnesses is useless. Bumpy didn't threaten Anastasia. He didn't need to. Instead, he explained the environment Anastasia was sitting in, who the bartender answered to, who controlled the exits, who would hear about this meeting within the hour. Power, Bumpy understood, only mattered if others believed in it, and Harlem already believed in him. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally, as if describing weather patterns rather than human leverage. He gestured slightly with his glass, not toward Anastasia, but toward the room itself, the bartender, the door, the men who looked like customers and nothing more. Bumpy didn't list names. Names made things personal. He talked in roles, in functions, in systems. He explained that the bartender didn't work for him, but he trusted him. That the man near the door wasn't armed, but he didn't need to be. That the exits were clear, not because no one was guarding them, but because no one needed to. Anyone who tried to leave the wrong way would be remembered long before they reached the sidewalk. Anastasia listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, but his posture had changed. He was no longer leaning forward. He had shifted back slightly, as if reassessing the space between himself and the table. Bumpy noticed. He always did. Bumpy continued, explaining that within the hour, men who were not in that bar would know exactly who Anastasia had spoken to, how long the conversation lasted, and how it ended. Not because anyone was spying, because Harlem talked. It always had, and it talked with accuracy. He'd made it clear that this visibility wasn't a threat. It was a condition. Anastasia had come in daylight because daylight carried witnesses. Bumpy was honoring that choice. What happened here would not be buried. It would not be denied. It would not be reframed by intermediaries. It would be understood exactly as it occurred. That was the difference between their kinds of power. Anastasia's authority thrived in shadows, in basements, in back rooms where men disappeared and explanations followed later, if at all. His reputation moved through rumor and fear, stories that grew larger the farther they traveled. It was effective, but it depended on distance. Bumpy's power required proximity. He ruled a neighborhood where people saw him regularly, where children knew his name, where business owners could point to a moment when he had solved a problem without making a spectacle of it. That kind of power didn't need amplification. It lived in memory. Bumpy explained that killing him would not erase that memory. It would sharpen it. That removing him wouldn't dismantle the structure Anastasia was sitting inside. It would provoke it. Harlem didn't fear martyrdom. It understood continuity. He said this without drama, without raising his voice, without daring Anastasia to act. He simply described cause and effect the way one describes gravity. If something fell, it would fall downward. If violence came here, it would not remain contained. Anastasia had spent his life being the final consequence in other men's calculations. He was used to seeing fear bloom quietly across faces when they realized who sat in front of them. He did not see that fear now. What he saw instead was confidence that didn't depend on bravado. The men nearby weren't listening openly, but they were aware. That awareness mattered. Power without witnesses was just violence. Violence could be denied. Witnessed power became fact. Bumpy understood that Anastasia could walk out of the bar and still have the capacity to kill him later. That wasn't in question. What was in question was whether doing so would achieve anything Anastasia wanted. Harlem would not interpret it as conquest. It would interpret it as intrusion. And intrusions demanded responses. Bumpy leaned back then, signaling that he had said what needed saying. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't seek agreement. He allowed the silence to do its work. Anastasia looked around the room one more time, not searching for threats, but measuring belief. He saw men who trusted the system they were in. He saw a bartender who didn't flinch. He saw a room that would remember. In that moment, Anastasia understood something fundamental. He could command fear anywhere in the city, but fear alone could not govern Harlem. Here, power needed witnesses, and Bumpy Johnson already had them. The violence that didn't happen. Anastasia was used to fear changing rooms instantly. It didn't happen here. No one flinched. No one moved. No one reached. That silence told him more than gunfire ever could. If violence happened, it wouldn't end quickly. It wouldn't end cleanly. And it wouldn't end in his favor. For the first time in years, Anastasia recalculated in real time. He had seen the pattern hundreds of times. A shift in posture. A glance toward an exit. The subtle tightening of a jaw when men realized who was in the room with them. Violence didn't need to be announced. It announced itself through preparation. Here, there was none, and that absence was deliberate. Anastasia let the silence sit, testing it. In most places, stillness meant fear. Men froze because they didn't know what to do next. In this room, stillness meant something else. It meant discipline. Everyone knew exactly what to do. And what to do for now was nothing. He scanned hands again. No sudden movements. No nervous fidgeting. No one reached beneath a jacket or shifted a chair to clear space. The exits remained unguarded in the obvious sense, which meant they were guarded in every other sense. Violence here wouldn't explode outward. It would fold inward. Anastasia understood violence as escalation, a sharp act that collapsed resistance and forced alignment. But escalation only worked when the other side wasn't already prepared to absorb it. Harlem looked prepared, not eager, prepared. He imagined the first move. A signal, a blade, a gun pulled from somewhere close. The room would change, but not the way he was used to. It wouldn't scatter. It wouldn't panic. It would contract. The men who hadn't moved would move then, not toward exits, but toward purpose, toward containment. That was the problem. Anastasia's power thrived in chaos, in the confusion after something terrible happened, in the vacuum where leadership disappeared and fear rushed in to fill the space. Harlem offered no vacuum. Killing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't collapse the room. It would activate it. He thought about the men outside, the driver waiting in the car, the distance between here and the sidewalk. He thought about how long it would take for word to travel if something went wrong. Minutes, not hours. And once it traveled, it wouldn't stop at the block. It would spread north, east, west. Through bars, clubs, churches, apartments, through people who didn't carry weapons but carried memory. Anastasia had made his name by ending problems decisively. But decisive violence required clarity. This situation offered none. Too many variables. Too many unseen lines of response. Too many men whose loyalty wasn't purchased but earned. Bumpy Johnson remained still across from him, not watching Anastasia, but watching the room. That told Anastasia everything he needed to know. Bumpy wasn't worried about Anastasia's next move. He was confident enough to worry about everyone else's. The imbalance wasn't physical. Anastasia could still kill him. That fact hadn't changed. What had changed was the cost. Killing Bumpy here wouldn't look like strength. It would look like a foreign execution in a neighborhood that didn't recognize foreign authority. And foreign executions invited retribution. Anastasia had survived long enough to know when force solved problems and when it multiplied them. This would multiply them. Quietly at first, then publicly, then permanently. He imagined the commission hearing about it after the fact, dealing with consequences they hadn't authorized. He imagined explaining why Harlem had become unmanageable overnight. That explanation wouldn't land well. So he did something rare. He paused, not theatrically, not to show doubt, just long enough to let the equation settle. Violence was an option. It simply wasn't the right one. Not here. Not now. Not with witnesses who would interpret it their own way. The room remained still, but the meaning of that stillness had shifted. It was no longer waiting. It was resolved. The decision had been made without ceremony, without agreement, without blood. Anastasia adjusted his jacket once, a small, unconscious movement that signaled conclusion. He met Bumpy's eyes again and saw no triumph there. No relief, just confirmation. The violence that didn't happen mattered more than any violence that could have, because everyone in that room would remember it. They would remember that Albert Anastasia had come into Harlem ready to assert dominance and had chosen restraint instead. They would remember that Bumpy Johnson had not needed to threaten, posture, or raise his voice. They would remember who had controlled the moment. Walking away is not retreat. When Anastasia stood to leave, it wasn't because he'd lost his nerve. It was because he understood cost. Harlem wouldn't fold, and killing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't solve that. It would ignite something that couldn't be contained by commissions or contracts. Walking away preserved order. Staying would have destroyed it. He rose without urgency, smoothing his jacket as if the meeting had ended exactly when he intended it to. That gesture mattered. Men like Anastasia never showed retreat in their bodies. They reframed it. Standing was not surrender, it was closure. No one stopped him. No one moved to block his path. That, too, was deliberate. Harlem did not need to escort him out to make a point. Letting him leave on his own terms reinforced the balance that had just been established. He was not fleeing danger. He was acknowledging boundaries. Anastasia glanced once more around the bar, this time with a different lens. He noticed how quickly the room relaxed, not because he was gone, but because the tension had served its purpose. The silence hadn't been fear. It had been containment. Now that containment was no longer required. Bumpy Johnson did not stand. That was the final message. If Bumpy had risen, followed him, or offered a closing remark, it would have implied pursuit or negotiation. By staying seated, Bumpy made it clear that the center of gravity had never shifted. Harlem hadn't reacted to Anastasia's presence. It had absorbed it and let it pass through. Anastasia walked toward the door, knowing that everyone would remember how he left. Not hurried, not angry, not embarrassed, just deliberate. That mattered to him. Reputation was a currency he had spent his life accumulating, and he had no intention of squandering it on a symbolic stand that would produce real consequences. Outside, the daylight hadn't changed. Traffic still moved. People still walked. Harlem did not freeze because Albert Anastasia had entered it, and it did not exhale because he was leaving. That continuity told him everything he needed to know. He reached the Packard and paused before getting in, looking back up the avenue. There were no men rushing out of buildings, no sudden movements, no need to signal his driver to be ready. The street was calm in a way that could not be faked. Anastasia understood now that Harlem wasn't defiant. It was self-contained. It did not challenge the commission because it did not recognize the commission as relevant within its borders. That was a more dangerous position than rebellion. Rebels could be crushed. Systems had to be negotiated with or avoided. Killing Bumpy Johnson would not decapitate Harlem. It would radicalize it. It would turn a stable system into a grievance. And grievances had a way of outliving the men who caused them. Anastasia had seen enough wars to know which ones never truly ended. Inside the car, he said nothing to the driver as they pulled away. There was nothing to explain. The decision had already been made and would not be revisited. The commission would hear about this encounter later, filtered through his words, framed as assessment rather than withdrawal. He would tell them Harlem wasn't worth the disruption, that it was functioning, quiet, profitable in its own way, that interference would draw attention they didn't want and resistance they didn't need. It would sound practical, sensible, strategic, and it would be true. Bumpy Johnson watched the car disappear without expression. He didn't savor the moment. He didn't mark it as a victory. Victories attracted challengers. He treated it as maintenance, another problem addressed, another boundary reinforced. Within the hour, Harlem would know what had happened, not through gossip, but through certainty. Anastasia had come. Anastasia had spoken. Anastasia had left. No blood, no deal, no surrender, just recognition. That recognition mattered. Walking away was not retreat. It was preservation. It allowed the larger underworld to continue functioning without a fracture that would invite scrutiny, violence, and instability. It allowed both men to remain what they were. Anastasia kept his reach. Bumpy kept his ground. And Harlem remained exactly what it had been before the Packard arrived, untouched. Why Harlem remembered this day, no shots were fired. No bodies fell, and yet this meeting reshaped New York's underworld balance for years. Italian power stopped at Harlem's border, not because it couldn't push through, but because it finally understood what pushing would cost. Bumpy Johnson didn't win by force. He won by making himself untouchable in the only way that mattered. Word moved through Harlem the same way it always did after something important happened, quietly, without embellishment. No one needed to exaggerate the story because the facts were enough. Anastasia had come. He had sat with Bumpy Johnson. He had left. That sequence alone carried weight. Men who had lived through decades of pressure from outside syndicates understood what that meant. The Italian underworld didn't hesitate when it smelled weakness. It tested, provoked, absorbed. The absence of follow-up told its own story. Harlem wasn't being punished. It wasn't being pressured. It was being avoided. That avoidance was respect in its purest form. Within days, small adjustments followed. Italian intermediaries stopped making inquiries north of 110th Street. Meetings that had been requested quietly disappeared from calendars. Men who had been thinking about shifting loyalties reconsidered. Nobody announced a policy change. Policies didn't need announcements when they were enforced by memory. Bumpy Johnson didn't capitalize on the moment publicly. He didn't expand operations. He didn't issue statements through proxies or send messages through enforcers. He kept Harlem exactly as it was. Stability was the proof. Any sudden change would have suggested vulnerability. Consistency suggested control. The numbers banks continued to run without interruption. Clubs stayed open. Street disputes were handled the same way they always had been. Harlem's rhythm didn't change, and that was precisely why the meeting mattered. Outside power had come to test the system, and the system had not reacted. Men noticed. Young hustlers learned a lesson without being taught. They saw that power didn't always announce itself with blood. Sometimes it announced itself by preventing bloodshed. Older men recognized something rarer. They saw a boundary hold. For years afterward, Italian bosses referenced Harlem differently in private conversations, not as an opportunity, not as unfinished business, but as a special case, a place with its own gravity, a place where interference required more than muscle. It required justification. That was the shift. Bumpy Johnson became untouchable, not because no one could kill him, but because killing him would solve nothing. His influence was embedded. He wasn't a bottleneck. He was a stabilizer. Removing him would destabilize Harlem in ways no syndicate wanted to manage. The commission understood that even if they never said it out loud, they had seen what happened when men mistook independence for defiance. They had seen neighborhoods turn into long-term liabilities after a single miscalculation. Harlem did not need to become one of those, so it remained intact. The significance of that day wasn't recorded in police blotters or trial transcripts. It lived in the absence of action, in the deals that were never proposed, in the crews that were never sent, in the violence that never arrived. Harlem remembered because nothing changed. That kind of outcome was rare. Underworld history was usually written in bodies. This was written in restraint. In a single afternoon where two men measured each other accurately and chose not to break the balance. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the meeting. He didn't need to. His authority wasn't built on legend. It was built on continuity, on the fact that Harlem remained Harlem year after year, while other neighborhoods burned through kings and soldiers. People remembered the day because it confirmed something they already believed, that Harlem was not a prize to be claimed. It was a system to be respected, and that Bumpy Johnson was the man who had earned the right to speak for it. Years later, when younger men asked why Italians never pushed north, the answer was simple. They had once, and they had learned. No one remembered what Anastasia had offered at the table. No one remembered the exact words spoken. They remembered the outcome. They remembered the line that held. That memory became part of Harlem's internal geography, as real as street corners and building facades. It informed decisions. It shaped behavior. It kept violence from spilling across borders. That was why the day mattered. Not because something happened, but because something didn't. And in the underworld, the events that don't happen often carry the heaviest consequences.